right, let's get started.
That works.
All right, thank you for your patience with going back and looking at all that material from the preface introduction principle. If you have questions about that, comments, I'll be invite those. I do want to turn to the text of what must the beginning of science be made. I don't think we'll ever get there if I don't just turn us there, so I'm going to do that pretty abruptly. But if you do have questions about the material I've talked about already, they'll come up again, I guarantee you, in this material that we're about to talk about here. All right. So let me note first something about the text that we're talking about. I've already alluded to this, but I just want to come back and kind of point to some passages that are useful here. So I want to note two things about it. One's a historical philological point, and I won't do this very often, I promise, but it's worth doing here because there is such a big block that came in later. So the text that Giovanni has translated for us is the text of the second revised edition. This is the 1832 is when it was published. Hegel died 1831. And he was working on these revisions to the science of logic literally up until his death. He died 1 or 2 weeks later. I forget whether he was working on the Phenomenology 1 week out or revisions to Phenomenology, revisions to the science of logic 1 week out, something like that. Anyway, he died in 1831. Didn't finish the revisions, but got some of them done. What he got done here was on, he wrote a new preface, right, for the science of logic. We'll read that at the end. He also he revised the introduction, right, so that's what we've already read is the revised version of the introduction. I didn't worry us there about the difference between the 1832 and the original 1812. But I am going to worry us about that here in this text because this text begins, right, so take a look at this. This is on page 45, 53 in the German. With what must the beginning of science be made, right? You have that, and then you have this paragraph that begins, it is only in recent times that there has been a new awareness of the difficulty of finding a beginning in philosophy. Everybody sees that, right? Well, starting there, all the way down to, go over to page 47, 55 in the German, about halfway down that page, you see logic is the pure science. Remember that's in italics. Logic is the pure science. Everybody got it? So everything from page 45 up to 47 at that place, right before that place, right before logic is the pure science, that all got added. Not a bit of that was there in 1812. In 1812, there's a short little introductory remark he puts, basically says, given what we've shown in the Phenomenology, here's what you can see in this text. Logic is the pure science, that is pure knowledge in the full compass of its development. And then that's basically where the 1812 with what must the science begins there. Well, there's a whole lot of stuff that he's added, right, that precedes that. So that's worth just knowing that the majority of the revisions he made here were in response to critical reviews, and they mainly were in response to, look, you're using subject-object language, which, reflective thought type of language, and you need to get that out of here, which he does. He takes it out of the doctrine of being, so we'll see that there. But they're also an attempt then, the methodological revisions, or the revisions, I should say, are attempt to remain faithful to that notion of immanence, right? To make sure that we talk about how concepts develop on their own. But he also added this significant new material, what I just pointed out to you, the first 4.5 paragraphs to that section we're examining today. So I'll go back and talk about that addition, what it was, and what the original looked like, and those kinds of things in just a moment. The other thing I want to note here is that there's a distinction, I've already alluded to this, between the philosophical systematic portion of this text and its polemical portion of the text. So, as I mentioned earlier, as I read this section, it is a hybrid. It contains a short scientific systematic introduction of the beginning. That's basically pages 45 to 48, right? So it stops at page 48. That's the systematic elaboration. What happens after that? Well, at 48, he appends a non-scientific, non-systematic comparison of the present work with historically relevant projects like those of Kant and Reinhold, Fichte, Schelling, and Hölderlin. That's pages 47 to 55, what we call the further reflections. Now, I think he tells us this pretty directly, right? If you look at page 48, right in the middle of that page, he says, after this simple exposition, what alone first belongs, everybody see where I'm at? So to this simple analysis, I'm retranslating, but it's the same gist. To this simple analysis of what is only initially involved in what is most simple, the logical beginning, we may add the following further reflections. Now that's a red flag for Hegel. He's saying, look, I've done systematic presentation, I'm now going to do something different. What's that? Look what he tells you about it. Yet these further reflections cannot They cannot do what? Be meant to serve as elucidations and confirmations of that exposition. This is sufficient unto itself, so it's like that first bit works on its own. It doesn't need this other stuff. Why? Because this is historical references, that's systematic explication. Since they are occasioned, this further reflections, they are occasioned by preconceived ideas and reflections. And these, like all preliminary prejudices, must find their execution within the science itself, where this is properly awaited with patience. Well, I don't know how patient we are at this point, but that's what he's saying, right? We're not going to get any of that stuff that I'm about to talk about until we get actually into the science itself. So I think that that paragraph is telling us, I'm now stopping the systematic exposition and I'm beginning a historical polemical discussion. So there's a pretty clear reference in Hegel to saying, I'm not doing systematic now. After this, I'm doing a historical analysis. Now, I think what that's useful, why is that useful for us, is because we'll treat the two texts differently. Right? Up to page 48, you should treat as imminent development of its own. No preconceptions, no presuppositions. Let's go. After that, of course, that's all of what it's about. Right? Is that those kind of presuppositions. So let's talk about the logical beginning. Let's talk about the systematic stuff, the first few pages 45 and 48. So if the core requirement, as we've been hearing it, the core requirement of science is that one must forget oneself and abide in the matter itself, then the first question that arises is decidedly methodological. How is one to begin such a science? How can you begin it in a way that remains faithful to the matter that is at issue in logic, without imposing from without a model of understanding or of what it is to begin an examination? I mean, you would just say, well, I know what logic is, so this is a book about logic, so it ought to be about logic. And he's just told you that's all about formalism, so that's a problem. So how do you start without supposing that? Where do you begin? And he tells you right at the beginning, page 45. He says this. This is from the 1832 additional stuff he put in. He says, this is the second sentence in that very first paragraph. The beginning of philosophy. Everybody see where I'm at? The beginning of philosophy. The beginning of philosophy must be either something mediated or something immediate. So two alternatives. Right? Mediated and mediated. We don't know what those mean yet. Fine. But it's got to be either mediated, the beginning's got to be either mediated, there's got to be some pathway to it, or it's just got to be, we can start it immediately. And it is easy to show, we'll ask ourselves how easy it is, but it is easy to show that it can be neither the one, mediated or immediate, nor the other. It can't be either one of them. I thought you said it has to be one or the other, and now it can't be one or the other. It's exactly what he just said. So either way of beginning, the mediated way or the immediate way, runs into, you have here, into contradiction. That would be Widerspruch. That's not in German. What he says in German is Widerlegung. It's refutation. It finds its own refutation. So I think it's best to hear what he's saying here is, I'm about to formulate the antinomy, not a word he uses here, Kantian word, the antinomy of beginning, that it must be this and the other thing, but it can be neither one of those things. So the beginning is either a result of a process, of a pathway, that's the mediated sense of beginning, or the beginning is an absolute immediacy. There is no pathway to it, you just start immediately. Immediacy and mediation are, however, as he tells you here on page now 46, this is, it's clear that he's referencing the third edition, the 1830 edition of the encyclopedia, so clearly this is written in 1831. He says, here we have only to consider, this is the very first paragraph of the beginning of the page. Here we only have to consider how the logical beginning appears. The two sides from which it can be taken have already been named, namely either by way of mediation, as a result, or immediately as beginning proper. This is not the place to discuss the question apparently so important to present-day culture, whether the knowledge of truth is an immediate awareness that begins absolutely, a faith, or rather immediated knowledge. Insofar as the issue allows passing treatment, this has already been done elsewhere. Go see my encyclopedia. Here we may quote from that encyclopedia, this idea, right? That there is nothing in heaven or nature or spirit, that's hyperbole, right? There's nothing in the world, or anywhere else that does not contain just as much immediacy as mediation. You have to have both. So you can't have either alone, you got to have both together. So that both these determinations prove to be unseparated and inseparable, and the opposition between them nothing real. Okay, so the beginning, we don't even know what this really means very much, but we can at least say this, right? The beginning must thus be both immediate and mediated, though it can be neither one exclusively. It's got to be both of them together in some way. But what does that possibly mean? Well, he says here, and this is on, he says now at the final paragraph down at the bottom of 46, this is still on 54 in the German. A beginning is logical in that it is to be made in the element of a free, self-contained thought and pure knowledge. It is thereby mediated. So here's the beginning is mediated. For pure knowledge is the ultimate and absolute truth of consciousness. So now we begin to get a sense of what he's talking about. The beginning is to begin with something that's been proved elsewhere. It's the truth of something else. What's the truth of? The truth of consciousness. So here he begins to say, I wrote a book about this. It's called the Phenomenology. The Phenomenology does what? It establishes that pure knowing, absolute knowing, is the truth of every other form of knowing. It's the truth of, in the sense that it's the ground of, is what makes all other forms of knowing possible. Kind of a crazy claim, right? To know things as they are in truth makes possible every other form of knowing. You can't have any other form of knowing. Since certainty, perception, and understanding, all the way through the phenomenology. You can't have any of those other exhaustive treatment of every other form of or image or model, a form of knowing. You can't have any of them unless at the ground of all of them, the basis of all of them, you have absolute knowing. So absolute knowing is not something in the phenomenology you actually aspire to attain. It's something you come to realize you have, because if you don't have it, you don't have even sense certainty. You can't even say, ow, that hurts, without absolute knowing. That's not absolute knowing, but you can't have absolute knowing. Sorry, you can't have sense certainty without absolute knowing subtending, undergirding, making that possible. So that's the argument of the phenomenology in a nutshell, 400 pages worth of epistemology. That's the argument of the phenomenology. But notice what he says. We said in the introduction that the phenomenology of spirit is the science of consciousness. So consciousness is about the relationship between the mind and the world. It's about the relationship between consciousness, awareness, and the world of which it is aware. This is not going to be a book about that, right? A phenomenology for Hegel is about the subject-object relation. It's about the relationship between consciousness and its objects, not this book. But that book, the Phenomenology, investigates consciousness. And the truth of consciousness proved to be what? Absolute knowing, pure knowing. Here's what he says about that. We said in the introduction that the phenomenology of spirit is the science of consciousness, its exposition, that consciousness has the concept of science, that is, pure knowing for its result. Okay, so we begin the science of logic mediated. Mediated by what? By the investigation we carried out in the phenomenology. And what did that investigation show? It showed that consciousness is made possible by pure knowing. So he says, to this extent, logic has for its presupposition, he didn't miss right. It has for its presupposition the science of spirit and its appearance. That's the phenomenology of spirit. Science and its appearance is phenomenology. That's what appearance is about. Right? A science which contains the necessity and therefore demonstrates the truth of the standpoint which is pure knowledge and of its mediation. It's what brings that about. So the beginning must be mediated. It's what the phenomenology does. It mediates the beginning of the logic. In this science of spirit and its appearance, the beginning is made from empirical sensuous consciousness. This is sense certainty. And it is this consciousness which is immediate knowledge in the strict sense. There in this science, in the phenomenology, is where its nature is discussed. Any other consciousness, such as faith in divine truths, inner experience, knowledge through inner revelation, he's just rattling off what goes on in the phenomenology, proves upon cursory reflection to be ill-suited as an instance of immediate knowledge. In the said treatise, phenomenology, immediate consciousness is also that which in the science comes first and immediately is therefore a presupposition. But in logic, the presupposition is what has proved itself to be the result. Pure knowing is the result. Absolute knowing is the result of that investigation. The result of the preceding consideration, namely the idea as pure knowledge, pure knowing. Now, as we know, this is where Hegel's about to settle down. Everything he's going to talk about at the beginning, with what must we begin, is pure knowing. And you want to say, well, what's that? Well, on this account, right, that he's just given you, it's the result of the phenomenology's investigation. Okay, fine, you just gave me a reference to another book I've got to go read now. What does that really do? What that supposedly does is it takes us from sense certainty and shows us that we can unpack what sense certainty is all the way through its various different dimensions, all the way different forms of consciousness, all the way through, and what we will see at the end of it is its ground. And its ground is what? Absolute knowing, pure knowing. So here, without that little tagline they had there in 1812, he's expanded that immensely. Right? He says, thank you in the 1812 version at the beginning of this with what must science begin. He basically says, thank you, phenomenology, for giving us absolute knowing. Now we can proceed. Here he's trying to say what that really was, what that contribution really was. Then he proceeds on. Here's 1812. Logic is the pure science, that is, pure knowledge in the full compass of its developments. But in that result, the idea has the determination of a certainty that has become truth. Certainty has become truth is his code word in the phenomenology for thought and being are one. Certainty has become truth. Certainty is consciousness, thought. Truth is being, they become one. It is a certainty which, on the one hand, no longer stands over against the subject matter, no longer does. This is the result of the phenomenon, what it's proven, what it's demonstrated, what it's shown. No longer stands over and against the subject matter confronting it externally, but has interiorized it, is knowingly aware that the subject matter is itself. The for itself is the in itself. And on the other hand, has relinquished any knowledge of itself. It can't be held on to as, oh, that's still subjectivity now. That's just thinking. It's not objective thinking. No, actually it is. It's subjective thinking. It's absolute knowing. And on the other hand, has relinquished any knowledge of itself that would oppose it to objectivity and would reduce the latter, objectivity, to a nothing. It has externalized this subjectivity and is at one with its externalization. It's internalized it, it's externalized it, they are one. That's his short version of the argument of the phenomenology. He then says this. Now, starting from this determination of pure knowledge. So that's a big if. Right? Let's just note what he just did. Right? If this phenomenology is successful in its demonstration, well, what is that demonstration? To prove that consciousness, the ultimate truth of consciousness, is absolute knowing, pure knowing, that thought and being are one. So he has a very minimal reading of, if you look back at absolute knowing, the chapter in the phenomenology, it's a very minimal claim there, but it's everything, right? The minimal claim is that thought and being are one. That's the only claim that he wants to walk out of the phenomenology with. But that's what it's been shown, that's what it's done. So we ask repeatedly, don't we need some kind of ladder into that standpoint? And Hegel tells you in the preface, that work, the phenomenology, is the ladder from ordinary consciousness, which takes thought and being to be separate. And by interrogating that relationship between thought and being, the forms of consciousness, what it shows is that they're actually one. In fact, you can't have knowledge of anything and any way of knowing things without having absolute knowing. Now, starting with this determination of pure knowing, all that we have to do to ensure that the beginning will remain immanent to the science of this knowledge is to consider, or rather, setting aside every reflection, simply to take up what is there before us. So he's saying, all we need to do now, having reached this standpoint in the phenomenology, all we need to do is just consider what the phenomenology has achieved. See what it's got, see what it's done, see what it's accomplished. It's shown that thought and being are one. So what do we say? Pure knowing, thus withdrawn into this unity, the unity of thought and being. Thus sublated, takes up, cancels, preserves. This is off-head. This is one of the first time he uses it in the text, in the science of logic. So this is off-haven. Term he took over from Schiller. Means to cancel, but also to cancel in the sense of raising up and lifting and preserving. So put up, take it, cancel, but also you put up. So it has taken up, canceled, and preserved every reference to an other and to mediation. So now there's just a unity of thought and being. There is no otherness outside of thought. Being is not extrinsic to thought at all. It is without distinctions, and as thus distinctionless, it ceases to be knowledge. I'm sorry, it's called absolute knowing, it's pure knowing. Why is it not knowledge anymore? Because knowledge refers to the relationship between thought to being, because it's the thought about being. knowledge of something that's distinguished from it, other than it. What we have before us, so what do we have before us in absolute knowing? Only simple immediacy. Now, Hegel says this all the time in the Phenomenology, right, in the final chapter. I've returned to sin certainty. Right? I've returned to the beginning. I've returned to the worlds directly and immediately there before me. But in sin certainty, I couldn't actually demonstrate that. I've just now shown that that's exactly what we have, the oneness of thought and being itself. So simple immediacy. Not even pure knowledge anymore. It's not knowing of something. It's just the dwelling in being that thought is doing. So simple immediacy, he next says in the next paragraph, is itself an expression of reflection. It's about knowledge. That's what reflection means. It's about still the distinction. Because immediacy is where things present themselves to consciousness. They are immediate to us. It refers to distinction from what is mediated. The true expression, so really what we've attained in the phenomenology, is not really absolute knowing. Shocker, right? This is not the way you would come out of the phenomenology thinking, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense. You would look at this and go, excuse me? This is 1812, he's writing this, right? So he's saying, what I just published 5 years ago is really not about knowledge. Well, it certainly looked like it. No, actually. It's about immediacy, but not even really immediacy. Because even that doesn't adequately mark what's happened, what's been achieved there. Well, what does? He tells you. The true expression of this simple immediacy is therefore pure being. Just as pure knowledge should mean nothing but knowledge as such, so also pure being should mean nothing but being in general, being and nothing else, without further determination or filling. So what Hegel's just said is if you go the route of mediation, the route of the beginning is the product, the result of something that precedes it. So it's mediated through something else. It's brought about through something else. And that something else is the phenomenology. Then what the phenomenology has achieved looks like it's pure knowing, but pure knowing is not the right term to use there because that would be just simply an immediacy. That thought is immediate to, or being is immediate to thought. But really what we have is a union, the unity of thought and being. So what you have is just simply pure being itself. Nothing more, nothing less. Vacuous, empty, no filling, no content. So that's what the phenomenology achieved. So absolute knowing is just pure being. It's really not even knowing anymore. It's just pure being. A lot of complications to talk about here. Hegel scholars fight over these passages, right? What does the phenomenology really look like from this perspective? Right? It looks like a work that's really undermining the very claim of knowledge. Because it's ultimately saying knowledge is not what makes knowledge possible. What makes knowledge possible is being, pure being itself. So he says now, he draws out from that the result. Look at the bottom 2 lines of 47, this is 56 in the journal. Being is what makes the beginning here. It is presented indeed as originating through mediation, but in mediation which is at the same time sublates itself. And the presupposition of it and the presupposition is of a pure knowledge, which is the result of finite knowledge of consciousness. So far, so good. We've gone down one side. Mediation, the thesis, think about the thesis, antithesis. Here we can do antinomy, right? We can talk thesis, antithesis, not the substance of the work itself, because it's not there. But we can talk about it here. The first thesis is the beginning is mediated. Where does the beginning is mediated lead you to? Pure being. With what must we begin? Pure being. Why? Because pure being is just absolute knowing when you think absolute knowing is truly what it is. But then look at what he does. It's kind of stunning at this point. This is 1812 again. Right? Look what he's doing. Second line down on page 48. But if no presupposition is to be made, here's that presuppositionalist and purely eminent claim, right? If we're not entitled, we can't take anything for granted. If no presupposition is to be made, if the beginning is itself to be taken immediately. So now we're going to go down the other side. We're going to look down the antithesis, that the beginning is immediate. Not that it's mediated, but that it's purely immediate. What could that mean? Look what he says here. Then the only determination of this beginning is that it is to be the beginning of logic, of thought as such. The beginning of thought, what does that even mean? He says, there is only present the resolve. It's a willful act. To do what? which can only be viewed as arbitrary. To do what? To consider thinking as such. Not consciousness, not thinking about something, just thinking as such. You could just resolve, act of the will, you could just resolve and say, I'm going to make the decision to do this. I'm going to think about thought as such. He calls that in other texts to think abstractly, to think purely, to refrain from any presuppositions at all, surrender them all, let them go. What would you be left with? You'd be left with thought, pure thought itself. But as we just heard, thought, pure thought itself is what? Pure being. So look at what he does with this. There is only present the resolve, which can only be viewed as arbitrary, of considering thinking as such. The beginning must then be absolute, or what means the same here, must be an abstract beginning. And so there is nothing that it may presuppose, must not be mediated by anything, or have a ground. So it's not the result, it's just a decision. We're going to think abstractly, we're going to think purely, we're going to think without presuppositions. It must not be mediated by anything or have a ground, ought to be rather itself the ground of the entire science. It must therefore be simply and immediacy, or rather only immediacy itself. Now we've already been here before, right? If you're immediate, then you have a reflective relationship to it, right? To talk about immediacy means something's close, something's in front of me, there's no barrier between me and it, but there is separation, right? So immediacy is a problem. It's immediate to us, some kind of way. He says, or rather only immediacy itself. Just as it cannot have any determination with respect to an other, so too it cannot have any within. It cannot have any content. For any content would entail distinction and the reference of distinct moments to each other, and hence a mediation. If it's really going to be immediate, then it can't have any mediation. And it can't have the mediation of, for example, thought and being separate from one another. So what do you end up with again? The beginning is therefore pure being. Now look, what I think Hegel just did there was he took you down two paths. He took you down the thesis, the beginning is mediated. He took you down the antithesis, I'll get it out eventually. The beginning is immediate. He said if you're going down the mediated route, what do you get? You get the phenomenology is the presupposition of the science of logic. What does it attain? It attains pure knowing, but pure knowing is pure immediacy, and pure immediacy is just pure being. End result of that pathway, pure being. He says the other pathway, okay, let's go down that one for a moment. Let's say the beginning is the beginning with immediacy, not mediation, but immediacy. What do we get there? Well, we get the resolve to think purely, to think abstractly, to abandon, to set aside, to put into bands, to put between brackets, as Husserl would tell us. That we're not going to be committed to any of these things anymore. We're not going to take them as something we're going to inhabit. We're not going to reject them because that would be to take a position on them. To reject them, to negate them in that sense, to set them aside and say they are wrong is precisely to take a position on them. So even that we're not going to do. We're going to step out of all of these commitments, these positions that we've taken up with respect to being and thought. We're going to disinhabit those. What does that leave you with? Pure immediacy. But what's pure immediacy? Pure being. So if you go down either one of these two sides, where do you end up? The same exact place, pure being. So with what must the science begin? Don't know if you got it. The pure being. Now here's an interesting question, right? That's the main point of what he's trying to show you, is that it doesn't matter which one of these sides you go down, whether you go down the mediated or you go down the immediate, which side of the antinomy you go down, you're still going to end up in the same place. You're going to end up with pure being. So pure being is the answer to the question of what must we begin. And so amazingly, or maybe not so, we begin with pure being. As he says on page 59, looking ahead, I didn't sign this for the reading, he says there, being, pure being, without further determination. So just so you're clear, that's why we start there. We start there because it doesn't matter if we're taking this as the result of the phenomenology, or we're taking it simply as a result of a resolve to think purely. So there's two versions of the ladder here, two versions of the pathway. One version through the phenomenology, let's call that phenomenological pathway. Phenomenology as Hegel understands it, right, which is the relationship of consciousness to its object. Or we have the route of abstraction, to think abstractly. To abstract here doesn't mean to extract from something you already have and find this generality. It means to withdraw from any commitments that you have, to think presuppositionlessly. That's even What does that get you? Same result, being pure being without further determination. And then the science has to flow from there. It flows imminently from there, if it flows at all. If anything's going to happen, it's not something we're going to do to pure being. It's something that pure being is going to do to itself, of itself, by itself. Right? Now, then he gives this paragraph, right, that I mentioned earlier, which is kind of the transitional paragraph from. I just systematically elaborated this antinomy of the beginning and showed you that the results of both of them end you up in pure being. And he says then, after this simple exposition of what alone first belongs to the simplest of all simples, the logical beginning, we may add the following further reflections, which should not serve, however, as elucidation and confirmation of the exposition, that stands on its own, but are rather occasioned by notions and reflections, which may come our way beforehand, and yet, like all other prejudices that antedate the science of logic, must be disposed of within the science itself. Can't hold on to these, and are therefore to be patiently deferred until then. So here he's saying, right? We can do the polemics about the beginning. That's what I'm going to enter into now. You can get the proposal, well, the beginning is being, but really what they mean is not pure being. They mean being in a kind of determinate way. It's already got content filled into it, and you simply unpack that. Well, that's got the problem if you presuppose the content, all you're doing is unpacking it. This is a charge that Schelling makes against him, right? Schelling says the being already has embodied within it the concept. Come on, all he does is pull it out. He's rigged the whole system. Hegel's trying to say, I know about that. He's saying that, this is 1812, he's saying that before Schelling ever says what he says. But he's already acknowledging, I could have gone that route, didn't I? I said pure being, not being with a determinacy already built into it. I didn't say it was the I think either, I didn't say it was the I, the ego, like Fichte would say, right? Because I know that's the proposal on the table, that's an axiomatic certitude that you could begin with, but I didn't go that route either. Why? Because that presupposes that thought is separate from being. And I didn't claim that we have this kind of magical intuitive power called intellectual intuition that can grasp this beginning and then everything else can flow from it. So all these historical references, reflections in some form, fashion, or another, as I said at the beginning of today, can plausibly be seen as a rejection of the Hegelian, Schellingian option. Why don't you go down the route of being? Why don't you go down the route of self-consciousness? Why don't you go through intellectual intuition, which, by the way, Fichte and Schelling and Hegel all affirmed in different ways, but they all affirmed intellectual intuition. And Hegel is saying, because all of that is massively compromised, because it's indebted to presuppositions that we cannot, without pain and skepticism, exposing ourselves to skeptical attack, we can't imbibe. So what must we do? Well, it looks like we've got, if you just left it that, it would sound like, well, we've got kind of two alternatives, right? You can go down the phenomenology route, right? That's going to mean you have to read this other book if you haven't already. And then you have to see how this works as a, building on that. The beginning is mediated. Or option B is you can take the route of pure thinking. Just switch off all this other stuff, disembed yourself in it, and go for it. Thinking as such. And that'll already be to think being, because one of the things you had to abandon was the separation of thought and being. But what Hegel says in 1831, when he's writing about this, right? Go back to this again. Middle of page 46, 54 in the journal. Here we may quote from it, he says in the middle of that page, quoting from the encyclopedia, that there is nothing in heaven or nature or spirit or anywhere else that does not contain just as much immediacy as mediation. That sounds like you don't get to choose between these two. That somehow or another they are incumbent upon one another. They reach the same conclusion. They're both about pure being. They're going to get you to the same place. But somehow or another, methodologically, you need both of them. In other words, you need to work through consciousness and all the forms of consciousness that we might be encumbered by. To do what? To show that they ultimately end up in pure being. You may need to do some of that still. You may need the work of the phenomenology. But you also have got to operate with what? The demand of the resolve of pure thinking. So you're constantly going to be working with both of them. The immediate and the mediated. The mediated, the phenomenological route, the mediated, the route through pure thinking. So he says that both these determinations prove to be unseparated and inseparable, and the opposition between them nothing real. So as he says at the beginning, right, just to remind us of this, it's only in recent times, the first lines again, page 45 of this section, it's only in recent times that there has been a new awareness of the difficulty of finding a beginning in philosophy. And the reason for this difficulty, and so also the possibility of resolving, has been discussed in a variety of ways. The beginning of philosophy must be either something mediated or something immediate. either or. And it's easy to show that it can be neither the one nor the other, not because both are refuted. They're refuted on their own, as he says. So either way of beginning runs into contradiction, finds its refutation. If you try to go down one or the other alone, you need both of them together. That's what will get you to the beginning. With what must the science begin? Pure being. That's what will get you there. Mediation? Yeah, you're going to need that. Pure immediacy? Yeah, you're going to need that. Does that make a little bit of sense? That makes some sense of those passages, that exposition? Because now I want to talk a little bit about what he does on 48 and 49 with this progression in logic. Right? Yeah, please.
I guess I just want a little bit more clarification here. Why can't we just begin in this purely immediate way if it opens up this space of pure thinking, and we could just watch being develop itself dialectically through determinate self-negation?
Yeah.
What kind of positive role, or maybe negative role for that matter, I'm not sure, does the phenomenology play? What's the point of it, in other words?
No, I think this is a really important question. So what he says in this rendition of the text is that you need both. They play different functions, and they're, as I read it, mutually supportive of one another. Right? That's what he means by they're inseparable. Right? You've got to have both of them at work at the same time. So there's going to be days when you need the phenomenological route. There's going to be days when you need, you've got to have both of them working together. What do? They support one another. So your commitment to be presuppositionless is going to be challenged because you're going to find you have presuppositions. And what are you going to have to do with those? You're going to have to go down the phenomenological route to see why those actually can't hold, or why they actually entail pure being itself without those determinations. So they work hand in hand, they work together, they are mutually implicatory, they're mutually necessary, they both advance us towards or put us in the position of the standpoint we need to be in to do a genuine science. So that's the answer in this text. That's 1831's answer. So as you can imagine, I'm about to give you there's another answer in 1812. Right? So in 1812, just look at the text. None of that is said in 1812. That's bit about mediation and immediacy work. None of that's there, right? That's something he references in the third edition of the encyclopedia. So what is he saying in 1812? I think in 1812 he's saying, well, you could go down the phenomenological route. That's what he begins with, right? In 1812 he says, he has that little, very small, short tagline that says, okay, we've gotten to the point that the phenomenology has gotten us to, which is pure knowing. That's literally all he says there. We've gotten to this. Thank you, basically. We've got it. But then he immediately starts saying, right, look at the passage as it reads now. This is middle of page 47. Then he says, logic is the pure science. And then he builds from there. And now you don't have this, well, you have the phenomenological route, like it's there, he unpacks it a bit here, right? And he says, what that really means is pure being. But then he says, but we also could go this other route. This is on 48, second line down. But if no presupposition is to be made, well, we could just go that route. If we're not making any presuppositions, if we're not going to build on some work of something else, that's what that meant in 1812. If we're not going to go down the mediated route, he's left it in here, so it's still there. But if we're not going to go down the mediated route, we could just go the immediate route. We could just say, I've resolved to think purely. I think so that's what he meant in 1812. There were two ways to start the science. They both were starting with pure being, no doubt about it. One was mediated, the other is immediate. And you can either go through the phenomenology, or you don't have to go through the phenomenology. Okay? You could just resolve to think purely. But what he's become convinced of by 1831, earlier than that actually, but by 1831 certainly, is that you can't actually do that. You need both ways, because they are mutually supportive of one another. You can't just resolve to think purely, because that resolve to think purely is going to constantly be tested, because you actually, there's more to say about this, but we are historically shaped and molded, Hegel has recognized by this point, for various reasons. That experience is a fund, a repository of prejudices that runs very, very deep. So the hermeneutical point, the point made to him by Schleiermacher, the originator of hermeneutics, who told him, the only way we have knowledge is a result of our traditions. And Hegel goes, there's something to that. I don't agree with the end of it, which is our knowledge is only of those traditions, only tradition bound. right? And all we can do is interpret our traditions, and that's the best for what we can call science. That's Schleiermacher, right? Schleiermacher thinks precisely that. He does, well, he does that. So that's Schleiermacher. This is his arch rival in Berlin, by the way. This is Hegel's. They hate each other, right? But this is Hegel going, I do think you're right about this, which is pretty amazing for Hegel to do, because Hegel didn't think he was right about anything. But he doesn't to be conceding to Schleiermacher. There's something right about this notion of we are tradition laden. So if we're gonna, we can't just wake up one day and, as an act of our will, say, all that tradition, yeah, schlocked it off. Not gonna be burdened by that, not gonna be determined by that, not gonna be dictated by that. That stuff is not gonna affect the way I think. I'm gonna think purely without having any of those presuppositions whatsoever. I'm not gonna negate them, that's what a Cartesian would have done, right? A Cartesian would have submitted them all to hyperbolic doubt and said they've all gotta go. If the ones who couldn't go, then we'll retain those. No, I'm not gonna proceed that way either. I'm gonna let go of them. That's what it means to think purely. I'm gonna let go of these commitments. I'm gonna not inhabit them anymore. Put them in parentheses, the way Husserl puts it. That's the neutrality modification. We're gonna switch them off. We're gonna neutral with respect to them. But by 18 whatever, right? We can talk about when I think he actually made this change, but clearly by 1831, he's convinced that you can't just turn that off. That you have to always have that commitment, the resolve to think purely, and combine that with the working through of our commitments, those traditional commitments. And the working through of them means to see how the phenomenology demonstrates that these things are actually not commitments that you want to have, that they're the commitments that ultimately end up in pure being itself. So they perform a kind of dismantling negative work. That's what he thinks by 1830. That's a long-winded answer to a better question than my answer. Does that make some sense?
That's helpful. So you would say that the mediated way, namely through the proceeding through the phenomenology, supports the unmediated, immediate way, just leaping into pure thinking,
right,
by showing that any of these presuppositions that might threaten to encroach upon the endeavor at hand,
yeah,
ultimately are resolvable into absolute knowing.
Yeah, they entail absolute.
They entail it, yeah.
So the very
ground.
things that, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you want to say?
No, right, they entail it as their ground, and so
Right.
then it has, so it sounds to me like it really is kind of a primarily negative function. Maybe not
I mean, it's not wholly negative. It's not
wholly
saying let's
negative,
destroy
yeah.
consciousness.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
what
it's
it's saying
not
is that
Cartesian in that sense.
right.
Yeah.
It's not saying let's destroy consciousness. Let's dismantle all the things that consciousness thought were true and show them all to be false.
Right.
What it's showing is that all the positions that consciousness takes with respect to its object, all of them, exhaustively, can be accounted for and be shown to entail one another, and ultimately they entail pure knowing, which is pure being. So the very thing that they're supposed to be objecting to, starting with pure
Yeah,
being,
right.
and all the entailments that follow out of pure being, they actually are predicated upon themselves.
Yeah.
So it's negative in the sense that any one of those could stand on their own, any one of those positions of thought, presupposition we might have, could stand on its own. That's being undermined, absolutely. But positively, it's also showing that those actually entail and are made possible by pure knowing itself, which is the oneness of thought being. So the only way you can have sense, certainty, perception, understanding, whatever other form of consciousness you want to talk about, is predicated on absolute knowing itself, and that is pure being itself. It's not what someone who read the phenomenology would necessarily think. Let's be clear, right? But it's Hegel telling you that's what I was doing in the phenomenology. So it's his own rereading of his work. But just to do the other side of that, that's clearly how the mediated side works. The immediate side is saying, but I have to have the commitment to presuppositionless for any of that stuff to even work that way, right? It's not relevant unless I'm committed to not inhabiting those presuppositions. So why would I even work through them in this way unless I have that underlying commitment? Right? So already there's a willfulness about we're going to do science. And to do science, we have to set aside all our presuppositions. And then and only then does the phenomenology become relevant because you've already made that commitment. That's not how the phenomenology works, by the way. It's not what the phenomenology says about what you do there, right? It doesn't say you have to be committed to presuppositionlessness in order to undertake the journey. But clearly the way he's couching its methodological significance for the system itself, the significance of both pure thinking and the phenomenological route is in this way. Does that help?
Yeah, thank
Have I lost everybody? We make some sense of this? Okay. Other questions, comments? Okay. Well, let me spend a little bit of time talking about one of the issues that are here. That is about this, how does justification operate? Right? What's the form of justification? Because I think this is important for what goes on in the science of logic generally. So he talks here, this is on pages 48 through 50. 56 through 59 in the German. So this is the beginning of that material just after the transition. So he makes the transition, and he talks about this preliminary conception of progress in logic. So this is the material I'm focusing on. So we've talked a little bit about this stuff. I want to talk about this section now. What does it mean to progress? What does it mean to actually have logical entailment, logical derivation? That's what he means by progress here. How do we move from one concept to another? We've already had this discussed a little bit in terms of, well, the concepts move themselves. But what in the world does that even mean? And so here he comes back and talks about this. So the progression he's talking about is what we could call the justification, right? It's how you do justification for Hegel. So we move from one concept to another, and that justifies the preceding concept. Right? That's its justification. So justification doesn't come before concepts. The concepts are the conclusion to a justification, a justificatory reasoning. The justification actually comes from the concept itself as it progresses into another concept. That's why you can say the succeeding concept is the truth of, the ground of, the result of the prior concept. It justifies it, proves it. That's progression. Now, of course, linear justification is the standard way of thinking about justification. Linear justification. Arguments in which, that's linear justification works this way. Arguments in which propositions that occur later in the chain of reasoning are regarded as true, later in the chain of reasoning, are regarded as true by virtue of their relation to the preceding propositions, right? So our standard thinking of, when we think about an argument, premises to conclusion. Premises to conclusion, linear justification. Why is the conclusion justified? Because of what is said in the premises. So those lead linearly to that conclusion. Hegel well knows this. He knows the science of logic you're about to investigate, back to examine with him, doesn't operate like that. Being is not the first premise. Being is not the first premise of an argument. It doesn't work that way. So how does it work? So we can think of linear justification, you think about examples all over the history of philosophy. This is standardly what anyone thinks they're looking for. So when Socrates says to someone, you seem to know a lot about justice. What is justice? He wants them to give him a logos, give him an account of what justice is. Well, they've got to give a first premise, and it leads to this is their conclusion. So this is what justice is. Therefore, justice is X. That's linear justification. But Hegel is going to talk about here a circular form of justification. He says the science of logic, the entirety of the system, by the way, the science of logic, is a form of circular justification. He says, take a look. Take a look on 48 in the English, 57 in the German. He says, this is the bottom paragraph on 48, just above 57 in German. The insight that absolute truth must be a result. Here's the crux of the matter, right? The absolute truth is the result, not the first, but it's what comes last. And conversely, that a result presupposes a first truth, which, because it is first, objectively considered, is not necessary, and from the subjectified is not known. This insight has recently given rise to the thought. These are polemical, right? So recently we're talking about how people have argued about this. That philosophy can begin only with something which is hypothetically and problematically true, and that at first, therefore, philosophizing can only be a quest. Because we're going to take some things for granted. That's the problematic and hypothetical. Hypothetically true, problematically true. We're going to work from them, and then we'll see if we can actually prove those one day. And that's our aspiration. This is a view that Reinhold has repeatedly urged in the later stages of his philosophizing, and which must be given credit for being motivated by genuine interest in the speculative nature of philosophical beginnings. That's always Hegel's prelude to, I'm about to decimate this, because it worked that way. So there's been an advance here. Congratulations, Reinhold. Thank you. But then he says, a critical examination of this view, that's him, will also be an occasion for introducing a preliminary understanding of what progression in logic generally means. For the view has direct implications for the nature of this advance. Indeed, as portrayed by it, progression in philosophy would be rather a retrogression. Here's the warning, right? If the truth is the result, then truth comes last, then the ground comes last. We retrogress into the ground. Indeed, as portrayed by it, progression in philosophy would be rather a retrogression and a grounding, only by virtue of which it then follows as a result that that with which the beginning was made was not just an arbitrary assumption, but was in fact the truth, and the first truth at that. Okay, wait a minute, are you telling me that being, the truth of being, is proved only by being shown to be the concept? That's the massive argument of the science of logic, by the way, right? Being, essence, concept. Concept comes last. That's the ground of everything that precedes it. So, and we'll have to be careful with that notion of ground, but let's use it loosely for the moment. It's the truth of, it's the ground of, it's the result of being. So being becomes truth by virtue of the result. Well, that means that we reversed the manner of justification. We don't start with what we know and derive what is knowable thereby. He says at the top of 49, it must be admitted that this is an essential consideration, one which will be found elaborated again within the logic itself, that progression is a retreat to the ground. It's a Grunde gehen in German, right? He's playing on that term. It means to perish. Right? So Grunde gehen means to collapse and fall apart. But he's saying it's to go to the ground. He reads it literally, does this all, every time he picks up on this line, he loves it. The collapse of something, it looks like the obliteration of something. It looks like it's abstract negation. It's not. It's determinate negation. You thought it was completely obliterated. It's not. It's determinate negation. It was negated in one respect, but not in others. And that leads to this transformation. So the transformation is what? It's a transformation where you get to the ground. You go to the ground of the thing that you were talking about. So the ground of being is what? The concept. And the unfolding of the entire work is that demonstration. That's why he comes back in the very last few pages and says, what this work has demonstrated is nothing other than what concrete being would be. We started with vacuous, empty, pure being. What the rest of the logic demonstrates is what being's determinations are. And therefore what concrete being, fulfilled being, he said, calls it at one point, would be. So he says that progression is a retreat to the ground, to the origin and the truth, on which that with which the beginning was made and from which it is in fact proceeded depends. There's retrogressive grounding. Middle of the page on 49. Essential to, this is the end of that same paragraph. Essential to science is not so much that a pure immediacy should be the beginning. Well, we just spent a whole hell of a lot of time talking about whether it was mediated or mediated, and it turns out it's immediacy in both cases, but that's really pure. It seems like we caused quite a fuss about that for quite a while. But here he says, that's not really the most important thing. Well, it sounded like it was. Essential to science is not so much that a pure immediacy should be the beginning, but that the whole of science itself is a circle. Now the term there is Kreislauf. Right? Kreis, K-R-E-I-S, is circle. Kreislauf is circulation, cycle. So Giovanni could have helped us a little bit because that is a richer term than he's portrayed. Sounds like it's merely circular functioning. I don't think that's quite right. I don't think Hegel doesn't pick his words innocently, right? So see where he comes back to this. But the whole science is itself a circulation in which the first becomes also the last. Circulation I prefer because it's a becoming, right? The first, pure being, becomes the last, the concept. And the last, the concept, becomes the first. It is pure, it is being now, not in its purity, its vacuousness, but actually in its fulfilledness, its completeness. He says now, not in the next paragraph, the paragraph just after that, in this advance, so in the advance, the movement of the progression, the beginning thus loses the one-sidedness that it has when determined simply as something immediate and abstract, which is what we're starting with. Right? The beginning is pure being, it's immediate, it's abstract, it's vacuous, doesn't have any determination. It becomes mediated. So, in one sense, the whole book is about being. Literally everything in it is about being. Even essence is about being. Concept is about being. But it's all about the determination of being. All the vacuousness that we start with, the purity that we start with, will prove out on its own. We won't do this to it. This won't be something we foisted upon it. Hey, that's abstract and vacuous. We got to put some determinations in there. Surely we got to, because the world's like that, so we got to make it up by having something in it. No, none of that. We will see if being has any determinations, it's because being gives itself those determinations by virtue of its own immanent development. In this advance, the beginning thus loses the one-sidedness that it has when determined simply as something immediate and abstract. It becomes mediated, and the line, the linear, the line of scientific forward movement consequently turns into a kreis, into a circle. So here Hegel is clearly saying that systematic deduction, systematic derivation, systematic proof, systematic entailment is ultimately circular. That you advance into by receding back into, retrogressing back into the ground. So, just to stay with our stupid little example, which we'll get less stupid about next week, being nothing, becoming is the ground of being nothing. It's the truth of them. It's the retrogressive ground of them. It's that from which being and nothing have any sense that they are what they are. So to progress for Hegel in a systematic context is to regress. There's your paradox for the day. To progress, to demonstrate, to derive something, to prove something, to demonstrate something, is to move back into something. It's to regress. Moving back into is a form of grounding and establishment. Moving back has a justificatory function. It secures the status and veracity not only of its outcome and its result, but of that from which it proceeds. The advance is a retrogression into the ground, in a sense, to what is originary, to what is true, on which depends, and in fact from which originates that with which the beginning is made. That's the top of 49 again. So that from which everything originates, the beginning, the first, is the result, the last of the progressive development. Pure being is that from which the progression begins, and it is the ground, is the idea to which the progression recedes. The idea is the concept. So as he says here, the first, the beginning is last, the result, and the last, the result is first, the beginning. There's the circularity, there's the circulation. Now, science is circular then. That's what you ought to take away from that. But you ought to be worried about that. So let's worry about that for just a moment. Why worry about it? Well, think about what it's saying. Science is circular means that a body of knowledge justifies itself, and it does so by coming to its conclusion, to its end, to its last. And at that moment, it circles back upon itself, returns to its beginning, and by returning to its beginning, it validates its beginning, the first. So the last is derived from the first, and the last entails the first. Or better said, the first entails the last entails the first. That sounds like massively circular reasoning. A skeptic would look at that and say, freaking circularity, that's vicious circularity. You assume something to be true to prove something else, and then you proved it, and then you turned around and used that to prove the first thing you assumed. What could be more circular? Now for Hegel, circularity ensures that the various parts of the system are actually immanent, complete, and there's consistent immanent development from one to the next. It justifies the whole, and the whole that they form justifies each of the parts. But you ought to say, that's viciously circular. That's what you just told us. You've admitted that it's fallacious reasoning, that this is going to fail. So I want to think about that with you for just a moment. Does that problem make sense to everyone, at least as a problem? Right? If he's admitting that it's circular, he's admitting that it's fallacious. That looks to be the simple way of, he's just outed himself. He's just told us, yeah, I'm about to engage in circular reasoning. As we all know, guilty as charged by the skeptics, that's fallacious. So my project's going to fail. Now, as you can imagine, that's not what he thinks he's doing, right? But you could grab hold of it, many people have, and said, he's a circular thinker, so as he thinks in circularity, he's guilty as charged of that position. So I want to give a little historical context to this, and then come back and think about what he means by circularity in terms of that context. I'm going to compare him to Fichte, right? Who's where we really get this circularity claim from. So in modern German philosophy, if you wanted to do systematic projects, then you really wanted two things to be able to be, you wanted two things to be possible. You wanted to unify all concepts, propositions, and doctrines through the demonstration of their deductive interrelations. You want to be able to show that a system mutually implies all the other parts of the system. You want to show that they're deductively, conclusively intertwined with one another. And you also, so that's one thing you want to be able to do, so the deductive interrelation. But you also want to be able to show that the foundation was apodictic and secure, so that apodicticity, that absolute certitude, would then be communicated, be conveyed to all the various parts that are derived from it. Now this is where Kant comes into the debate, right? Again, Kant plays this decisive role quite often. And he says, well, both those ambitions are great, right? All the rationalist, systematic philosophers before him, Wolff and Lambert and others, had tried to do it these ways, and they were opposed. Some of them thought, we got to find the axiomatic beginning, and then we can derive everything from it. And the others were like, no, what's really important is the deductive relations between the various parts. So they were focusing on different aspects, and they say this is what's essential. So Kant, in his inimitable way, comes in and says, ha, you need both. So he writes it this way. He says, famously, this is the first critique, B860, he says, you know what a system is? It's the unity of the manifold of cognitions under one idea. The unity of the manifold of cognitions under one idea. Apodicticity of the idea, right? Unity of the manifold, deductive interrelations. So he gets both, right? In that one curt definition of what a philosophical system is. So he joins together those two desires, those two desiderata, the things we want. We want deductive interrelation, we want secure foundation. Now Fichte's the one who picks up on this, right? So Kant never wrote that system. He keeps telling us, like, we got to do the critique of reason before we can do the actual system of reason. Standard Kantian move, right? We've got to do the critique before we can do the system. He did the critique, and never actually gives us much of the system. But at least we know what a system would be, right, from Kant. And it integrates those two ideas of deductive interrelations and apodictic certain foundation. So Fichte says, right, I want to do actually the system, not the critique thereof. So I want to get to the system itself. And he showed that the only way you can do both of those is through circular reasoning. So that's Fichte. That's the one who's introduced circularity into this discussion, not Kant. It's Fichte. But why? Fichte knows that circular reasoning has a bad reputation, right? He's read his skeptics. He's well aware that they all claim that if you engage in circular reasoning, it's fallacious reasoning, and it opens you up to attack, the undermining of any kind of claim like this. So why would he go there? Why would he go there? Well, his claim, Fichte's claim, is that the only way you can know that you have an apodictic foundation, the only way you can be certain that you have an apodictic foundation, is it has to be self-evidently clear, right? Self-evidently given, self-evidently certain. But then you've got to unpack it. This is what analysis does, right? It unpacks all the truths that are included within it, because all of them are included in that first principle. If it's the foundation of all things are included in it. So you ought to be able to unpack it. And how do you know when that's done? Here's the circularity moment. You know it's done when the only inference you can make, you've pulled everything else, his technical term, exhausted the first principle. You know when you've exhausted, when you've come to complete totalization, you're done with the system. When the last thing you entail is only the inference back to the beginning. That's the last entailment you can make. If that's the only entailment you can make, then you can know that your system is complete. You can know you've totalized it. You've got everything there is to know. You're done. Your system has been fully and completely, to use Fichte's technical term for this, constructed. So why do we want circularity? We want circularity because that's the mark of complete, ultimate finishing of the system. In its final moment, it goes back to the beginning. So there's a wonderful metaphor in Fichte where he says, you're building a house, right, on a secure foundation. So the axiomatic foundation is the basis, is the foundation. And you're building everything up, all the other kinds of knowledge, you're building up on top of it, right? Makes sense? Good. And then he says, this is really problematizes the image he gives us. But then at the end, what do you got to do? The top has got to bend around to the beginning. Not how you build a building. It doesn't work that way. But it is how you form a circle. Right? You go from the axiomatic foundation, build out from it, and then the last thing you can do is not put a top on the top of it, but show that that final moment actually entails the beginning again. Then you'll know you're complete. Anything less, and you won't know you've exhausted his term again, that you've exhausted the first principle. There's circularity with Fichte. Is that what Hegel is doing? Well, in one sense, you could look at Hegel and say, well, I mean, yeah, that seems to be what he's doing. He's saying, right, he's just told us in these 2 pages, that when you begin with being, and you get to the result of being, which will be the idea, the concept, whatever the name for it is, that will bring us back to the beginning, then we've just done the Fichtean process, right? We just did exactly what Fichte said, right? We started with something, we explicated it fully, we analyzed, we unpacked everything that was in it, and then we got to the end. And the end, we knew was the end, we know we're finished, we know we're complete, and we've totalized absolutely completely, because we've exhausted being. And the mark of exhausted being is we come back to being at the end. In the end, we come back to the beginning. The last is the first is the last. Now, I gave you that context, obviously, to say that's not what Hegel's actually doing. But you can read what he's doing that way. You can absolutely see him that way. Except for he takes circularity in a different way. First of all, he's not a Fichtean, because as he goes on to tell us in the rest of with what must science begin, he doesn't have an apodictic foundation. Notice, pure being is not self-evidently the case. You have to get to it either through resolve, to abstract from all commitments, or through mediation, working out those commitments through a phenomenological investigation. So it's not apodictically certain in the first place at all. Being is not apodictically self-evidently the case. It is where we begin, but it's not apodictically certain the case. So already we're not following the Fichtean model of apodictic axiomatic foundation. So far, so good. Well, then how do we progress in the science? We progress through determinate negation. Concepts transform themselves, they other themselves, they negate themselves. And by negating themselves, they transform into other concepts. And those other concepts become the grounds of, the truths of, the results, because they're the results of determinate negation. And that proceeds on and proceeds on and proceeds on. And then it comes back around to, oh, and this is what pure being actually is in truth. Fulfilled being, the concept. It's what engenders, produces, creates that. So there's the circularity. But we're not going back to an apodictic foundation. So this isn't a matter of exhaustion. Notice, this is the weird thing about how this is going to proceed. Hegel's going to talk about this quite later in the text, but we can already see it a bit here. Pure being is not something we unpack analytically stuff from. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, it generates its own othering. So from it, right, it generates its own determinations. So in a sense, it is immanent still within being. We never leave being, right? So it's all within being. It's all analytic progression in that sense. But because it's othering and relating, it's also synthetic. So this isn't your standard derivational process where you're just either unpacking what's already included, that's analysis, or putting together things that are distinct from one another, which is synthesis. This is sort of, strangely, both at once, and both at once by virtue of determinate negation, because the concepts become other than themselves, but still are themselves and are truly themselves in that otherness, then it's analysis. But because it is the relating of those two to one another, it's also synthetic. So this isn't your standard garden variety, no surprise, exhaustion of your axiomatic first principle. You don't have an axiomatic first principle in Hegel, and this isn't the exhaustion thereof, because everything isn't packed into it. It's generated through the process of determinate negation. So here's the issue. Determinate negation is the progression, the development, the derivation, the justification. It's how it works in the science of logic, in the system as a whole. So if that's not an exhaustion of a first principle, then what is it? Hegel tells us in another text that it's the bearing out, the Behren. It's the proving out of, in this case, with what you begin with, pure being. So what does it mean to prove that out? To let it develop of itself, to show what it is, and what it ultimately entails from its own negation of itself, is that it's essence, and then it's ultimately concept. And what does that mean? Well, in concept, then we have being as it is determined by itself. We've come back to being in that sense. It is circular. But have we come back to the beginning as the beginning originally was? No. So I would submit to you that that's not a circle. That's a circulation. A constant development out of the immediacy of the beginning, the abstractness of the beginning, the vacuousness of the beginning, its determination through determinate negation, and then coming back to it, not as what it was, which is exactly what you do in Fichte. You come back to the beginning completely as what it was. Here you come back to it now with what it truly is in that last moment. So when he says that the first is last, he means that the first, pure being, now becomes fulfilled being, the last. And in the last, it is still being. It's immanently developed therefrom. So that's not a simple, let's return to the beginning, circular formation. It's a circulation. That's why I think he picks that term there. So when you think circularity for Hegel, you have to think it through and by virtue of determinate negation. If you think it through and by virtue of determinate negation, then it has to be, at its very core, a process of continual and utter differentiation. It doesn't come back to its identical spot, because there's no identical spot to go back to anymore. It's not there available anymore. It is what it is only in these determinations. So Hegel has a way of thinking about circularity, which I would submit is not your standard garden variety way of thinking about circularity. It is a way of thinking about circularity where we come back to and we continually create what he calls in the encyclopedia a circle of circles. A circle of circles, which sounds like spirals at that point. That's a lot closer to what he's doing. Now there's problems with that view, there's problems with how to think about it, but I think that's a lot closer to what he's thinking about with circularity than the simple way of reading these passages that I just pointed out. All right. That makes some sense? That has to generate some questions, all of that today had to generate some questions. That's enough of me though. Questions, issues, comments? It's all absolutely clear? It can't possibly be. Yeah, Tawfiq,
Okay, I can't help not thinking of Hammond's critique of Kant, because I feel like, okay, all of this is okay, pure thinking, pure being, but you cannot think of pure thinking without language,
Yep.
right? And it seems to me that Hegel is taking language for granted. Because when you think in a particular language, and you cannot move from this particularity to some kind of absolute knowledge or pure thinking. So I'm not sure if this is right or not. So this is the first.
It's absolutely relevant. I mean, it's a version of the Schleiermachian objection, right? Which is to say we're tradition-bound beings, and part of that tradition is our linguistic traditionality. Now, Hammond would differ about where language comes from. He believes it's divine, but you could also think that, like Rousseau did, and say it's not divine; it's historical, right? Right, which is what Heidegger also claimed. So, what's the status of language? I think that's an excellent question to ask. Hegel doesn't broach that question directly. In 1831, he does write this. So we'll read this at the end. So I'm going to ask you to be patient, and we'll come back to this massively then. But let's at least note that it's there for now. Here's what he writes. This is in the preface to the second edition. See if I can find it quickly. My memory is.
Do you think
lost.
it's page 12?
Yeah, is it the quote about the pools?
Ah, yes, thank you. Yeah, sorry, that's exactly what. Yeah. So on page 12, take a look at, thank you for that. Look at the bottom of page 11. Last two words there. He writes, to display the realm of thought philosophically. To display the realm of thought philosophically. So Tawfiq, here's, I think, exactly the point, right? To do that depends upon language. There's Hammond's objection, right? To Kant, it also would apply here to Hegel. Hegel's well aware of this. He wrote a review of Hammond's collected writings, which also has the meta critique in it, where that comes from. He says, that is, in its own imminent activity, or what is the same in its necessary development, had to be, therefore, a new undertaking. He's writing this in 1831. One that had to be started right from the beginning. Nevertheless, the received material, the known thought forms, must be regarded as extremely important fund, something we can draw upon, a repository, right? So here's like logic, as it's already been developed in ancient Aristotelian sense, but also in the modern Port Royal sense, we can draw upon that. Even a necessary condition of presupposition, right? We had to draw upon this as a presupposition. To be taken gratefully acknowledged, even though what it offers here and there is only a bare thread, so it doesn't really help us that much, but we're going to rely upon it. So he's conceding, right? Don't you have something that you're drawing upon? You're not doing this out of nothing. You're drawing upon something. The dead bones of a skeleton thrown together in a disorderly heap. That's his. Here's what the history of logic has given us. That, but it's bones we got to use. He says at the beginning of the concept logic, we need to enliven these bones. Right? We'll talk about that. Then he says this, which goes directly to your point. The forms of thought are first set out and stored in human language. Sprocket. And one can hardly be reminded often enough nowadays that thought is what differentiates the human being from the beast. And everything that the human being has interiorized, and everything that in some way or another has become for him a representation, and whatever he has made his own, there has language penetrated. So he's acknowledging your point, I take it there, right? And everything that he transforms into language and expresses in it contains a category, whether concealed, mixed, or well-defined. So much is logic natural to the human being is indeed his very nature. Now, what's the relationship then between logical categories and linguistic categories? If we, however, contrast nature as such as the realm of the physical with the realm of the spiritual, then we must say that logic is the supernatural element that permeates all his natural behavior. His way of sensing, intuiting, desiring his needs and impulses, and it thereby makes them into something truly human, even though only formally human, makes them into representations and purposes. Now, there's a lot more to do with that passage that I'm going to do here, obviously. But Hegel is clearly acknowledging the point you're making and saying something like the following. That, as he says here, the forms of thought are first set out and stored in human language. If you just give that to Hamann, give that to Herder, they'll run with it and say, and we're done, my friend. Right? Because either these are the thoughts of God, right? And we're thinking the thoughts of God after God's thinking them. And so we're beholden to that. Or this is our history and our traditions' ways of describing the world, and we're beholden to that. But none of that, none of this is about logical entailment. Not a bit of it. It's the fiat of God, or it's the will of God, or it's just simply the ways in which we've arranged to speak about the world. And we do that very, very differently in different cultures and so forth. And so that whole sort of sense, which is really Herder's point, that these are incommensurable with one another, these ways of thinking, right? Because of the different ways that language operates. Hegel wants to say that no, they're stored in there. They're not products of them. So that stored way of expressing this is going to do a lot of work for Hegel, because he wants to say that logic is the prerequisite for language, not language is the prerequisite for logic. He's got to argue for that. He doesn't do so here. He's referencing the argument he makes in the encyclopedia here. That's what all that stuff about representation and whatnot, I think, is about. But we'll come back to that at the end. It clearly means this, right? So here's where I think you struck at the heart of this matter. He is operating in the science of logic with a non-representational form of language. That is to say, it's not a language that's referential at its core. Right? So it's not about denoting. Bottle, right? It's not about the state of affairs being picked out by the term. It does do that, and it has to be able to do that, right? Because language is also referential and representational. Absolutely does that stuff. But he thinks at its core, that's not what language truly is. He's got to make an argument for that. Otherwise, you can't account for how language works in the logic itself. So I do agree that the logic requires, as one of its preconditions, not its presuppositions, but one of its preconditions, a non-representational form of language is at least possible, and that we can demonstrate it within the system itself. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
What that would mean, how we would demonstrate, all those are open questions, right? None of that's solved, none of that figures that out. But I do think the objection goes to the very heart of the matter of what's going on here, because as we'll quickly say next week, right? Here's this term being, here's this term nothing, here's this term becoming. They have an historical association with one another. Right? Gadamer famously says this, right, in his essays on the logic. He famously says, yeah, being, nothing, becoming, that makes sense because that's the pre-Socratics. Right? That's Parmenides, that's Heraclitus. Yeah, of course. Now that's not how Hegel's going to think it works, because Hegel can't use that historical reference as any kind of justificatory. He has to show that being necessarily entails nothing, necessarily entails becoming. Both of those entail becoming. But Gadamer just says, oh yeah, we know this. Hegel is writing the history of philosophy from the perspective of the logic. That's really all that's happening there. And of course this makes sense. But of course it makes sense because there are historical figures that follow this. But that doesn't have any necessity. That's not logical necessity. That's historical happenstance. Is that?
Yeah.
So we gotta do something beyond that to give an account of what's going on. Thank you. Other comments, questions? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could have any sort of brief delineation if you have any disagreements here with Holgate on the opening. One of the things that strikes me a bit is he seems to have a bit of an emphasis on the ability to just have the resolve, and the retrogressive grounding language he uses seems to be a bit different. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so we'd have to talk about the retrogressive grounding thing, because as far as I know, Holgate and I use it roughly the same way.
Okay.
That you regress into the ground of which something is the ground. He's worried about the ground language, right? So he makes quite a bit of this, and rightly so. We'll come and complicate that, because grounding language in Hegel, at this point, it's very generically used. It'll have a technical sense in the book, and it will always refer to a hierarchical relation of the ground to what it's grounded upon it. And that's not what he's claiming about the way this proceeds, right? But so ground is not ultimately the best word for this. But so we can talk more about that. But on the other side, yeah, we do disagree about this. Right? I do disagree with Holgate about this. Holgate wants to say, Holgate basically Holgate basically takes the 1812 position, which is that all you need to do, you can go the route of the phenomenology, but you don't have to. You don't need it. You can dispense with it. You could just will to think abstractly and begin with the beginning and pure being. And so you can start by just simply exercising the commitment to being presuppositionless. And if you'll refrain from, that's what to think abstractly means, to abstract yourself, to take yourself out of all these commitments, then at that point you would be a pure being, and you can proceed from there. Now you might have to, he's quite adamant about you have to retain that commitment and constantly check what you're doing against that commitment, because you constantly want to ask yourself, and ask Hegel, right? Have you put something that's extraneous into the account? Because if he has or we have, then it's no longer abiding with faithfulness to the matter itself. But he thinks you can do that without the aid of the phenomenology. I think that by 1831, earlier than that actually, 1827, Hegel has reconceived that relationship and thinks that there has to be aids to help you work through your tradition latedness, or the tradition latedness of experience, as a fund that you draw upon in working through the system itself. And so you need the work of the phenomenology, or something else like it. He gives another ladder along the way for this as well. But you need something else like it. Holgate doesn't think you need it. So yeah, I disagree with Holgate about that.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question about one of Schelling's objections, the one that related to duality.
Yeah.
And the fact that, at least from what I understand, Schelling takes it that in order for Hegel to make everything reconcilable,
Yeah.
he has to reduce everything to dualities which can then contradict and then unify.
Yeah.
My question is, I'm not understanding where the duality is coming from that Schelling apparently sees, because it seems to me like everything is inherently a unity. It's one concept contradicting and moving in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So where's the duality?
I think that's a great question, right? Back to Schelling. But let's give Schelling his due here. Right?
Uh-huh.
So when Schelling sees negation, he reads negation as you would standardly understand negation, which is one thing refutes another thing. That one concept is set in place against another concept. So there's two concepts, they're at odds with one another. One of them says A, the other says not A, whatever that is, and they contradict one another in that way. Right? And that is the duality, right, of contradiction. And then you can show, oh, no, they really don't separate themselves from one another. They're dependent, mutually dependent upon one another, so contradiction is resolved. So there's the reconcilability, and that's what he's saying is all things doesn't work that way. all differences are not of the contradiction variety. Does that make sense? That's roughly, I'm putting words in Schelling's mouth. Schelling doesn't quite put it this way, but I think it's reasonable to think about it that way. Deleuze and Derrida do explicitly put it this way, right? And they do so because Hippolyte taught him to do it this way, because that's the way Hippolyte thinks of this. So this is a Logic of Existence, part 2, Logic of Existence, Hippolyte's book. But you're right to wonder, where is that actually in Hegel? Right? Because so far as I presented, so far as I think the text supports, there is no such thing. There's no two concepts that come into a contradictory battle or conflict or tension with one another. And then the resolution of that tension gives us a third concept. I know that's the standard way in which we talk about dialectical thinking. We talk about even Hegel a lot of times. There's two concepts that are at odds with one another, and he shows how they're reconcilable in a third concept. Right? So you can go all over and you would say, well, being is a concept, nothing is a concept, they're in tension with one another, and they're reconcilable in becoming. Except that's not what the text says. Right? Nowhere in the text does Hegel present it that way. He says being is nothing. Nothing is being. They are literally dasselbe, the same. And you want to go, well then, where's the tension there? There is none at that level. There's none, they're the same. Well then, is there any kind of tension involved? They don't contradict one another. They don't negate one another in the standard ways we think about negation. So how is there any negativity at all built into that? Well, the negativity has to do with the fact that one vanishes, as he says, into the other. So they have a stability, they have a distinctness, but they actually lose that distinctness and become the other. Both of them do that. Being does that, so does nothing. It's not just being falls into nothing and, oh God, we've got to go to becoming and resolve that. No, being and nothing actually vanish into one another is the term he uses for this. They collapse into one another. Nothing collapses into being, it is. Being collapses into nothing because it is nothing, it's vacuous. Well, what's the name for that? Vanishing of one into the other. Well, that's neither one nor the other because that's a process that both of them are undergoing. So what names that process? Becoming names that process. It doesn't reconcile two opposed forces and two opposed concepts. So you're right to ask, where's the contradiction, right? Where is this duality? I think you'll be hard-pressed to find that duality you'll be hard-pressed to find that duality is actually at work in Hegel. Now there'll be a moment of contradiction that he talks about. That's in the Essence Logic, we'll talk about it there, where you do have things opposed to one another in that kind of conventional contradiction sense. But that's not the model for determinate negation. Not the only way of thinking about determinate negation, or even the primary way of thinking about determinate negation. The way he talks about determinate negation is this immanent othering of itself, where a concept of itself, of its own accord by itself, comes to be other than itself. Does that help?
Yeah. So, do you think then Schelling is misunderstanding something?
We'll see. Let's leave that open. Right? I've just given you reason to think that there's not much textual evidence, at least thus far, that Schelling was getting that right. But let's see. Right? I really want that to be an open question. I've just given you kind of, what you can see so far from Hegel and why you might want to think that at least that part of the accusation doesn't work, or is not very well textually grounded. But let's see if it really works out that way. Maybe the being nothing becoming thing is really an exception to a rule that's everywhere else to be found, that everything else is contradictions to one another, one concept over against another concept, and they reconcile in a third concept. Maybe that's the way that works in every other case, just doesn't work that way there. I'm already telling you that's probably not the case, but let's see. Let's see. I don't know. I mean, to be fair, right, to Schelling, let's see what the case of the matter is. We're over time, so if you need to go, I'll take more questions, but if we're over time, so if you need to go, I understand that. Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, so does the system have either apodicticity or something like apodicticity? And maybe the more important follow-up question is, at what point do we recognize that? Because in the case of something like Fichtean or any foundationalist, yeah, it has apodicticity from the outset because we've begun already from what is indubitable. I mean, the contrary cannot be thought.
Right.
Okay.
And all we're doing is
And we're just
conveying
seeing what's
that.
entailed by that, yeah.
It's truth preserving is the way Fichteans usually put it, right?
Yeah.
Once you've got apodicticity, certitude in the foundation, you translate that or convey that.
Right, everything else that follows from that has it.
Right.
Descartes too, it's the.
Yeah. Right, that's why you have an indubitable foundation, you want to have an
Right.
axiomatic foundation. Everything else can be, that can be communicated every
Right.
time.
So
Does-
that's not too hard to think, but
Yeah.
in this, as you put it, this circulation, this movement of
Yeah.
the dialectic,
Yeah,
where might we think apodicticity there, or more importantly, when can we recognize apodicticity?
right. So let me give you the standard answer and then reasons to maybe think the standard answer isn't sufficient. Okay? So the standard answer is at the end of the system.
Right.
That only in, at the end of the encyclopedia, right, the presentation of the system, only in the moment of philosophy, which comes at the end of the system, do you have this moment of what he says there, looking back upon what's been determined. And only in that moment of looking back do you have the completion of the entire system. And that's where you might say, okay, then we know that we know with absolute certainty. But notice it's all mediated. It's not in immediate intuition, right? It's not intuitive knowledge. It's borne out by, this is what he says in the passage, it's borne out by all the things that preceded it. But then and only then are you entitled to say, now we know with absolute certainty, right? We could say, only then, in the end, did we reach what was at the beginning, right, in an axiomatic system. Whether we're talking Spinoza, Descartes, whomever, Fichte. So that's the standard answer. I think there's a lot of merit to that standard answer, so please don't misunderstand me. Famously in 1827, Hegel says, he gives that's the final paragraph, and then after that he quotes in Greek the thought thinking itself passes from the metaphysics of Aristotle, right? So you think, oh my God, we're God, right? Because that's Aristotelian theology. This is,
Poeticos,
yeah, this is the thought thinks itself, right? So that kind of reifies or reaffirms that answer. But what he had done in 1817 in the encyclopedia, and then again in 1831, he brings it back and then retains the quote still from Aristotle, still in Greek, is lay out syllogisms as the conclusion of the system. And those syllogisms, I try to argue, are not apodictically certain in terms of their closure. In fact, they are necessarily open. So, but that's reasons to think maybe differently about it. But the standard answer is only in the end does it have the standpoint that Fichte, Schelling, and Schelling in a different way would demand about it, but certainly you see in Descartes, you see in Spinoza, would have that axiomatic foundation. Is that useful?
Yeah, thanks.
Other comments, questions? All right, we do being nothing becoming next week. And other things, but we certainly do nothing. So we finally get into the system. Yep. See you then.
Thank you.